If you ever see a man like Ethan Kong on his knees, pray you're not standing nearby when he gets back up. Rain hammered the narrow alley behind Hansio Grill hard enough to blur the city lights into streaks of gold and white across the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through downtown Chicago, but in the alley itself, everything felt unnaturally still. Ethan Kong knelt beside a dumpster with one hand pressed against his ribs, his dark overcoat soaked through from the storm. Water dripped from strands of black hair onto the concrete beneath him while 6 men formed a loose circle around his position, their expensive jackets darkened by rain, their faces tense despite the advantage in numbers. That was the strange thing about fear. Even when Ethan Kong looked exhausted, even when he was cornered alone without bodyguards, people still feared him. Because men like Ethan didn't build empires by losing control. One of the men stepped forward, gripping a metal pipe tightly enough for his knuckles to pale. "You should have stayed out of Chinatown, Kong." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Calm. Unreadable. The kind of stare that made people second-guess themselves halfway through a threat. "You brought 6 men," Ethan said quietly, his voice smooth despite the rainwater running down his face. "So I'm guessing you already know how this ends." The man hesitated. Just for a second. But Ethan noticed. Ethan always noticed. A car passed near the alley entrance, headlights briefly illuminating the sharp lines of Ethan's face before disappearing again into the storm. The silence returned heavier than before. Then came the sound of a back door opening. All 6 men turned instinctively. A young black waitress stepped outside carrying a trash bag in one hand and a black umbrella in the other. She froze near the door as the alley scene unfolded in front of her. Her uniform apron fluttered slightly in the wind while rain tapped softly against the umbrella above her head. "Wrong alley, sweetheart," one of the men muttered with a humorless laugh. "Go back inside." She didn't move. Ethan studied her carefully through the rain. Most people reacted the same way when they saw danger. Panic. Confusion. Fear. But this girl didn't look afraid. She looked focused. Her eyes moved once across the alley, not randomly, but precisely. Left exit. Fire escape. Hand positions. Distances. Ethan felt something cold settle into his instincts. The waitress lowered the trash bag slowly onto the wet pavement. One of the men smirked. "Didn't you hear me?" The girl tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable beneath the dim alley light. "If you swing that pipe at his shoulder," she said calmly, "your wrist is too exposed." The alley went silent. Rain suddenly sounded louder. The man frowned. "What?" She adjusted her grip on the umbrella without taking her eyes off him. "You're standing too close. If he gets control of your elbow, you'll lose balance in under 2 seconds." Ethan's gaze sharpened immediately. The waitress finally looked at him directly, and for the first time that night, something shifted behind Ethan Kang's cold expression. Recognition. Not of her face. Of her composure. Because only someone who had lived through violence could stand this still in the middle of it. One of the men laughed nervously. "This girl thinks she's in a movie." But the waitress never looked away from Ethan. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. Ethan stared back at her through the rain. "And you're not a waitress." For the first time since stepping into the alley, the girl smiled slightly. But there was nothing soft about it. The man with the pipe forced out another laugh, but it sounded thinner now, swallowed by the rain and the tension tightening around the alley walls. "You got jokes, huh?" he muttered, shifting his grip. The waitress ignored him completely. Her eyes stayed on Ethan as if the other 6 men barely existed. Up close, Ethan could see details the darkness almost hid. The slight scar near her jawline. The way her shoulders remained loose instead of tense. The controlled rhythm of her breathing. She was not frozen by fear. She was calculating. Ethan slowly pushed himself to his feet, one hand still pressed against his ribs beneath the soaked coat. The movement alone made two men instinctively step backward. That almost made him smile. Almost. "What is your name?" Ethan asked quietly. The waitress glanced toward the alley entrance before answering. "Amara Brooks." One of the men rolled his eyes impatiently. "Enough of this." He stepped forward and pointed the pipe toward Ethan again. "This does not concern you, sweetheart." Amara finally looked at him directly. "Actually," she said softly, "it concerns me now." Something in her tone unsettled the group more than shouting ever could have. Calm confidence always sounded dangerous in places like this. A cold gust of wind swept Rain deeper into the alley, rattling the metal fire escape above them. Ethan noticed Amara's eyes flick upward for less than a second. Exit routes. Elevation points. Structural weaknesses. She saw the alley the same way trained men did. Like a map. The leader of the group exhaled sharply. "You think one waitress scares us?" Amara shrugged slightly beneath the umbrella. "No," her gaze drifted toward the pipe in his hand again. "Your decisions scare me more." Silence. One of the younger men shifted uneasily. Another glanced toward the street as if reconsidering why he had agreed to be there in the first place. Ethan noticed every crack spreading through their confidence. Fear was contagious. And Amara had just infected all six of them without raising her voice once. "You should leave," Ethan told her. "That is usually the part where people say thank you," she replied. Ethan stared at her for a long moment before something unfamiliar flickered across his face. Not amusement. Respect. It had been a long time since anyone spoke to him without fear attached to every word. A car horn echoed somewhere beyond the alley. Then came another sound. Tires cutting sharply across wet pavement nearby. Amara heard it first. Ethan noticed the exact moment her posture changed. Tiny. Almost invisible. But real. "You have 30 seconds, she said quietly. The man with the pipe frowned. "What are you talking about?" Amara slowly closed her umbrella. "Your driver is panicking." Rain immediately soaked through her dark curls as she lowered the umbrella beside her leg. And when nervous men start improvising, people make mistakes. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Then he heard it too. A vehicle idling harder near the alley entrance. Too close. Too sudden. One of the six men turned toward the sound, uncertainty flashing across his face. The leader swore under his breath. That was all Ethan needed to confirm it. Backup plans. Escape routes. Something had gone wrong. Amara stepped sideways slightly, positioning herself closer to Ethan without making it obvious. "You should not trust whoever sent them," she murmured. Ethan looked down at her, rainwater sliding from his jaw onto the pavement below. "And why would I trust you?" For the first time since entering the alley, Amara's composure cracked just enough for something deeper to show beneath it. Not fear. Memory. "Because," she said quietly, "I know what betrayal looks like before it happens." The alley fell silent again. Even the six men seemed unsure what to do next. And standing there beneath the storm, Ethan Kong realized the waitress had stopped acting like a bystander the moment she walked outside. She had been controlling the room ever since. The vehicle outside the alley accelerated suddenly, tires spraying water across the curb before stopping hard near the entrance. Every man in the alley turned toward the sound except Amara. She stayed perfectly still beside Ethan, rain rolling down the side of her face while her eyes tracked reflections in the puddles instead of the vehicle itself. Ethan noticed that immediately. Trained people never looked directly at danger first. They looked for movement. Angles. Shadows. "You expecting more company?" Ethan asked quietly. The leader of the group forced confidence back into his voice. "This ends tonight, Kong." But his tone had changed. Less certain now. Ethan could hear it. Fear always entered through the voice first. The headlights from the black SUV spilled into the alley, washing pale light across wet brick walls and rusted fire escapes. Two men stepped out of the vehicle wearing dark coats despite the rain. They moved carefully, scanning the alley with the stiff posture of hired professionals pretending not to be nervous. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not street guys," she murmured. "Private. Contractors." Ethan glanced toward her. "You can tell that from 30 feet away." "Street crews look angry," she replied softly. "Those men look employed." One of the newcomers walked forward and stopped near the alley entrance. "Mr. Kong," he called out calmly. "This situation does not need to become complicated." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. "Then why does it feel expensive?" The man ignored the comment and reached slowly inside his coat. Half the alley tensed instantly, but he only pulled out a phone. "You have been asked to step away from certain negotiations in South Korea," he said. "Tonight was supposed to be a conversation." Ethan's gaze hardened. "And 6 men with pipes was your version of diplomacy?" Rainwater dripped steadily from the man's hairline while silence stretched between them. Then the man noticed Amara standing beside Ethan. His eyes lingered on her for half a second too long. That was enough. Ethan saw her expression change instantly. Tiny. Controlled. But colder now. "You know him," Ethan said quietly. Amara did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the newcomer near the SUV. "No," she finally said. "But he knows me." The alley suddenly felt smaller. One of the 6 men looked between them nervously. "What the hell is going on?" The newcomer with the phone took another careful step forward. "Amara Brooks," he said evenly. "You disappeared 3 years ago." Ethan slowly turned toward her. Rain tapped softly against the metal dumpster beside them while the city noise faded into the background. Even the storm seemed quieter now. Amara exhaled once through her nose, almost tired. "I was hoping Chicago would be less observant." "You were declared dead," the man continued. "A lot of people were surprised when reports from New York mentioned a waitress matching your description." Ethan studied her profile carefully beneath the alley lights. She looked exactly the same as before. Calm. Controlled. But now he understood why. This woman had been hiding long before tonight. One of the younger men frowned in confusion. "Wait. Who is she?" The man near the SUV hesitated briefly before answering. "Someone very dangerous to underestimate." The alley went completely silent after that. No one laughed anymore. No one mocked the waitress standing in soaked sneakers beside the most feared man in Chicago. Ethan looked down at Amara, watching rainwater slide from her fingertips onto the pavement below. "You really are not a waitress," he said quietly. Amara finally looked at him again, and for the first time since stepping into the alley, Ethan saw something beneath her composure. Exhaustion. The kind that came from running too long without ever stopping. "I am tonight," she replied softly. Then her eyes drifted toward the men surrounding them once more. "The problem is that everyone keeps interrupting my shift." The rain finally began to slow, but the alley still felt heavy with pressure, like the city itself was holding its breath. Ethan Kong stood beside Amara in silence while the men near the SUV exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody seemed fully in control anymore. That was dangerous. Confused men made desperate choices. The man holding the phone slid it back into his coat slowly, careful not to provoke anyone. "You should not be here, Amara," he said evenly. "Neither should he." His eyes shifted toward Ethan. This was never supposed to involve civilians. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You cornered me behind a restaurant with 6 men and backup vehicles." His gaze sharpened. "Do not insult me by calling this professional." The man accepted the criticism without reacting. Circumstances changed. That usually means someone got greedy, Ethan replied. Amara remained still beside him, but Ethan noticed her focus drifting toward the rooftop above the alley entrance. Tiny details again. Angles. Shadows. Movement patterns. There are more watching, she said quietly. Ethan did not look up. How many? At least 2. One of the younger men swore under his breath and glanced upward nervously. The alley suddenly became very quiet again. The kind of silence where everyone realized the situation was larger than they thought. The man near the SUV adjusted his coat against the cold wind. Mr. Kong, this does not need to continue tonight. Ethan almost laughed at that. You already made sure it would. Another car passed somewhere beyond the alley, spraying water across the street outside. The city kept moving while 10 people stood trapped in a moment none of them fully understood. Amara finally bent down and picked up the umbrella she had set aside earlier. Her movements remained calm, controlled, almost gentle compared to the tension around her. You should leave, she told the 6 men quietly. The leader frowned immediately. You think you are giving orders now? Amara opened the umbrella slowly overhead. No, she said. I think someone else already did. Ethan saw it instantly. The shift in the men's faces. The uncertainty. The hesitation. Whoever hired them had stopped communicating. No calls. No instructions. No confidence left. They were standing in the rain beside a mafia boss and a woman with a buried past neither side understood. Fear was spreading. You abandoned them, Ethan said toward the man near the SUV. Interesting management style. The man's jaw tightened for the first time. You misunderstand the situation. No, Ethan replied softly. I finally understand it perfectly. The storm clouds overhead rumbled faintly while water dripped from the fire escape above them. Amara adjusted her grip on the umbrella handle and looked toward the alley exit again. You have less than 5 minutes before police units reroute this direction, she said calmly. One of the men blinked. How do you know that? Because the restaurant manager already called them 12 minutes ago, she answered. And downtown response times average between 8 and 15 minutes during heavy rain. Silence. Ethan slowly turned toward her again. You timed the police response. Amara gave a small shrug. I time everything. The alley felt even quieter after that. Ethan studied her carefully beneath the dim yellow light spilling from the restaurant kitchen door. Most people talked too much when they were nervous. Amara barely spoke at all. Every word she chose mattered. That made her dangerous in a different way than the men Ethan usually dealt with. The man near the SUV exhaled slowly before stepping backward toward the street. This conversation is finished for tonight. Ethan's eyes hardened. Conversations usually involve honesty. Then perhaps you should ask her what happened in Syria. The moment the word left his mouth, Ethan saw something shift across Amara's face. Not fear. Pain. Deep enough to survive years. Her fingers tightened slightly around the umbrella handle before relaxing again. The man noticed it too. You cannot hide forever, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked back toward the SUV without another word. One by one, the others followed him into the rain, leaving the alley emptier than before. Within seconds, only Ethan and Amara remained beneath the flickering alley light. Water dripped steadily from the umbrella edge while distant thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline. Ethan looked at her carefully. What happened in Syria? Amara stared toward the wet pavement for a long moment before answering. The kind of thing that makes people disappear afterward. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The alley had emptied, but the tension remained behind like smoke after a fire. Rain tapped softly against Amara's umbrella while Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wet brick wall beside the restaurant door. His ribs still ached beneath his coat, though he ignored it the same way he ignored most pain. What bothered him more was the woman standing 3 feet away. People lied to Ethan Kong constantly. Politicians lied. Rivals lied. Even loyal men lied when fear entered the room. But Amara did something stranger. She avoided lies by saying almost nothing at all. You timed police response, Ethan said quietly. You tracked exits before you stepped into the alley. You identified private contractors in seconds. His dark eyes stayed fixed on her. That is not military training. That is survival training. Amara stared toward the rain-slick street outside the alley. There is a difference. Ethan almost answered immediately, then stopped. That alone interested her. Most powerful men hated silence because it reminded them they were not fully in control. Ethan seemed comfortable inside it. Finally, he spoke. Military training ends when the mission is over. His gaze sharpened slightly. Survival training never does. Amara looked down at the umbrella handle in her hands. Then you already know enough. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled across the city skyline again. The restaurant kitchen door swung open briefly as one of the cooks stepped outside carrying boxes before freezing at the sight of Ethan. The man immediately lowered his eyes and disappeared back inside without a word. Amara noticed that too. They are afraid of you, she said quietly. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. Fear keeps people honest. No, Amara replied softly. Fear keeps people quiet. The alley went silent again. Ethan studied her carefully beneath the dim yellow light overhead. Nobody spoke to him that way anymore. Not directly. Not honestly. His organization stretched across half the city because people learned quickly that challenging Ethan Kong usually ended badly. But Amara did not challenge him. She simply refused to bend around his reputation. Somehow that unsettled him more. You should not work here anymore, Ethan finally said. Amara blinked once. That sounded less like advice and more like an order. Call it experience. Ethan pushed himself away from the wall slowly. People looking for you will come back. They already have, she replied. Ethan paused. How long? 8 months. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the umbrella between them. Ethan stared at her for a moment longer before speaking again. And you stayed anyway? Amara gave a faint shrug. Chicago is crowded. I thought I could disappear inside it. You do not disappear very well. For the first time that night, a small real smile touched the corner of her mouth. Tired. Brief. Gone almost instantly. I used to. Ethan noticed something then. Tiny details again. Her right sleeve had shifted slightly when she adjusted the umbrella. A faded scar crossed the inside of her wrist, thin and pale beneath dark skin. Not recent. Not accidental either. Ethan recognized restraint markings when he saw them. His expression hardened almost invisibly. Amara noticed that too and calmly pulled the sleeve lower again. Do not ask, she said softly. Ethan looked at her. For a long moment. You think I pity you? No, her eyes met his steadily. I think you are trying to decide whether I am useful or dangerous. The rain slowed further until only scattered drops echoed through the alley. Ethan stepped closer, not threatening, just enough to study her face beneath the umbrella shadow. And which one are you? He asked quietly. Amara held his gaze without flinching. That depends on who is asking. Somewhere beyond the alley entrance, police sirens finally echoed through downtown traffic. Faint at first. Growing closer. Ethan glanced toward the street before returning his attention to her again. You should leave before they arrive. Amara nodded once. You should too. Ethan almost smiled again. You keep giving orders to the wrong people. No, she replied softly as she turned toward the restaurant door. I keep giving warnings to men who think they are untouchable. Then she disappeared back inside the restaurant, leaving Ethan alone beneath the flickering alley light while the sirens drew nearer through the rain. The sirens grew louder as they moved through downtown traffic, but Ethan Kong did not move from the alley. The sound of emergency vehicles echoed off the wet brick walls, distorting in the narrow space until it felt like the city itself was closing in. He stood alone now, rain sliding down the collar of his coat, eyes fixed on the restaurant door where Amara had disappeared seconds earlier. People like Ethan were used to control. What they were not used to was uncertainty. And Amara Brooks had introduced exactly that. Inside the restaurant, the warm light contrasted sharply with the cold storm outside. Amara moved through the kitchen without hesitation, placing the trash bag into the disposal bin before washing her hands at the sink. Her expression had returned to neutral, the same calm mask she wore every shift. But her mind was not calm. She had recognized the pattern outside. Not the men. Not the weapons. The structure. Someone had been organizing pressure around Ethan Kong for weeks, tightening the net slowly instead of rushing it. That meant patience. And patience meant intelligence. She dried her hands and adjusted her uniform before stepping back toward the main dining floor. The restaurant staff avoided eye contact, sensing something had changed even if they did not know what. Meanwhile outside, Ethan finally stepped away from the alley wall and walked toward the street just as the first police vehicle slowed near the curb. Officers stepped out carefully, scanning the area, confused by the lack of visible disturbance. Ethan did not wait for them. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, slipping into the flow of pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. Within seconds, he disappeared into the rain-soaked crowd of Chicago nightlife. 2 blocks away, he stopped under the cover of an awning outside a closed boutique and reached for his phone. There were 3 missed calls from his security detail. 1 encrypted message from an internal contact. And 1 unfamiliar file attachment. Ethan opened it immediately. The screen displayed a name. Amara Brooks. Below it, classified markings that did not match any standard civilian record. His eyes narrowed as he read. Former Special Operations Support Analyst. Extraction Coordination. Field Medical Clearance. Last active deployment marked as terminated following unauthorized evacuation of personnel in northern Syria. Ethan lowered the phone slightly. So she had not been hiding from criminals. She had been hiding from consequences. That was different. That was more dangerous. A memory surfaced in Ethan's mind. The way she had identified contractor movement patterns in seconds. The way she tracked exits without thinking. The way she spoke about timing like it was instinct instead of calculation. None of that belonged to a waitress. Ethan closed the file and looked back toward the direction of the restaurant. Somewhere inside that building, Amara was continuing her shift as if nothing had happened. As if she had not just stood between him and 6 armed men without hesitation. As if she had not quietly rewritten the outcome of a situation that should have ended very differently. He began walking again, this time toward the restaurant entrance instead of away from it. Inside, Amara was serving a table near the front window. When she felt it. Not sight. Not sound. Awareness. The kind trained people develop when something in their environment changes without warning. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she finished placing a glass of water on the table, offered a polite nod, and only then looked toward the entrance. Ethan stood just outside the glass door, rain dripping from his coat, watching her without expression. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The restaurant noise continued around them. Plates. Conversations. Soft background music. But between them, everything was still. Amara set down the tray in her hands and slowly walked toward the door. She stopped on the inside, separated from him by only glass and reflection. Ethan spoke first. You are not on the record. Amara did not react. That depends on which record you are looking at. Ethan studied her face carefully. I know what you used to be. A faint pause. That is not something people forget. Amara held his gaze without blinking. People forget everything, she said quietly. That is why they survive. For the first time since meeting her, Ethan Kong did not have an immediate response. And in that silence, something unspoken settled between them. Not trust. Not fear. Something far more complicated. The glass door of the restaurant reflected both of them at once, overlapping in distorted fragments of rain and warm indoor light. Ethan Kong stood outside, still as a fixed point in a moving city, while Amara Brooks stood inside, framed by noise, motion, and the quiet rhythm of service continuing around her. For a few seconds, neither crossed the invisible boundary between them. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear through the glass. Your file is not clean. Amara did not look surprised. She also did not look concerned. No one's file is clean, she replied calmly. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. That is not what I mean. A waiter passed behind Amara carrying a tray of plates, glancing briefly at Ethan before quickly looking away. The normal world continued around them as if this conversation did not matter. But Ethan knew better. Conversations like this always mattered. Amara finally stepped closer to the door, her reflection now aligned with his. If you read my file, she said softly, then you already know why I do not answer questions about it. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Most people in his world reacted in predictable ways when confronted with their past. Denial. Anger. Fear. Amara showed none of those. Only control. You saved my life tonight, Ethan said. That creates a problem. A faint, almost imperceptible shift crossed her expression. For you or for me? For both, Ethan answered without hesitation. Behind him, the city lights blurred through the falling rain, headlights stretching into long reflections across the wet street. Amara glanced briefly toward the dining floor behind her. Customers laughed, unaware of the conversation happening only a few feet away from their tables. I did not save you, she said. I corrected a situation that was already unstable. Ethan almost smiled. That is a very precise way to describe it. Precision keeps people alive, she replied. Ethan took a step closer to the door, stopping just short of the threshold. Then help me understand something, he said quietly. You saw 6 trained men. You saw a controlled environment. You saw a situation that could have ended very differently. And you chose to walk into it anyway. Amara held his gaze steadily. You were already in it when I stepped outside. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. Silence stretched between them again. Inside the restaurant, a glass shattered somewhere in the kitchen, followed by a quick apology and laughter from staff who assumed it was nothing more than an accident. Ethan did not look away from her. You are still being watched, he said. Amara's eyes did not change. I am always being watched. Not like this. Ethan's tone sharpened slightly, but not in threat. In warning. The men tonight were not random. They were testing boundaries. If they return, it will not be in the same way. Amara nodded once, as if she had already calculated that possibility. Then I will adjust. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. You speak like someone who expects this to continue. It always continues, she said quietly. That answer stayed in the space between them longer than anything else. Ethan studied her again, this time not as a boss, not as a target, not as a man used to control, but as someone trying to understand a pattern he could not yet map. Why are you working here? He asked finally. Amara did not answer immediately. For the first time since they met, her gaze shifted away from his, just slightly, toward the reflection of the empty street outside the glass. When she spoke, her voice was lower. Because restaurants do not ask questions, she said. And because people who ask too many questions usually disappear from my life. Ethan absorbed that without interruption. Somewhere behind them, a customer called for the check. A manager gave instructions. Life continued in simple, ordinary fragments. But nothing about this moment was ordinary anymore. Ethan finally stepped back from the door. Then I will stop asking questions, he said. Amara looked at him again, searching his expression for deception or strategy. That is not how men like you operate. Ethan's answer was quiet. I am learning. For a brief moment, something almost unrecognizable crossed Amara's face. Not trust. Not fear. Something closer to uncertainty. Then she turned away slightly, breaking the direct line between them. You should leave, she said. If you stay here too long, people will start noticing patterns. Ethan glanced once more through the glass, then nodded. So will I, he replied. And then he walked away into the rain, leaving Amara standing behind the glass door, watching the reflection of a man who was no longer behaving like the others she had learned to avoid. Chicago night softened into mist after the rain, streetlights dissolving across wet asphalt while Ethan Kong sat inside a parked black vehicle 2 blocks from the restaurant. The engine was off, but his attention was fully active, tracking movement patterns outside, pedestrians lingering too long, a delivery van circling twice, subtle surveillance that suggested someone else was still watching Amara Brooks. Inside the restaurant, life continued normally, but Ethan no longer believed in normality. When Amara finally stepped outside after her shift, he was already waiting across the street under a dim awning, observing her not as a target, but as a variable he could not yet solve. You are still here, he said quietly. I work here, she replied, guarded. That is not what I mean, Ethan answered, revealing that external monitoring around the location had increased and become structured. Amara did not deny it, she simply said it was not new. Ethan then told her she should leave Chicago, but she responded calmly that people like her do not have destinations, only survival intervals. After a pause, Ethan surprised her, then let me change that. The offer was not control, nor demand, but something more unfamiliar, options. Amara studied him carefully, recognizing that men like Ethan rarely offered anything without cost, yet he insisted she was not safe staying where she was. She countered that visibility was dangerous for someone like her, and Ethan agreed that invisibility eventually ends in exposure. Their exchange became a negotiation of boundaries rather than trust, no interference in her disappearances, no disguised surveillance, limited observation only for safety. Neither called it agreement, but neither walked away. The city around them continued indifferent, yet between them something irreversible formed, an understanding that survival alone was no longer enough, and whatever came next would no longer belong to either of them individually.